I'm Rantasmo, and Goonish Shive needs more gay. Back when streaming video was a lot less convenient and YouTube was but a gleam in Satan's eye, comics were one of the chief forms of web entertainment, and the early to mid 2000s saw something of a webcomics boom. Oft considered among the nerdiest of mediums, webcomics frequently acted as an outlet for creators with particularly geeky interests. If you liked science and philosophy, there was Dinosaur Comics, a comic which I should point out this particular web series kind of owes its name to. If you liked D&D, there was Order of the Stick. If you liked movies, there was Multiplex. If you liked video games, then you were out of luck, because there were absolutely no webcomics in the 2000s about video games. Not a one. Real missed opportunity there. Goonish Shive has been running since 2002 and is still actively updated to this day. It's not a comic that I had read before, and before we get into the meat of this, let me just say up front, I did not have time to read the full 16 years worth of comics, so I mostly just referred to a recap and then read the parts that seemed most relevant to me. If I missed something important, I'm super sorry, but also, Daddy has things to do. I feel like the term webcomic implies a certain story aesthetic, and Goonish Shive is extremely webcomic. It's sort of a hybrid of high school slice-of-life dramedy with a good deal of sci-fi fantasy action mixed in. Basically, it's sort of like Degrassi, except with magic, aliens, martial arts, and shape-shifting furries. So it's like if Degrassi had a deviant art. I don't like to use the word cringy very often anymore, because lately I feel like it's a term that gets aimed at anyone who expresses even a modicum of vulnerability. That said, the artwork and writing of the earliest Goonish Shive strips leaves a certain something to be desired. Granted, this is true of pretty much every long-running webcomic. It was, after all, started when the author and artist Dan Shive was still a teenager. And who didn't do a few embarrassing things in high school? Me. That's who. I was perfect. There's a lot going on in this comic, but if it has one central theme, that theme seems to be transformation. Characters frequently shift back and forth between two or more different forms. That form could be an anthropomorphic animal, an angel, or more often than not, a different physical sex. Like many webcomics that got their foothold in the early 2000s, Goonish Shive is heavily influenced by Japanese manga and anime. The most obvious influence here is Ranma 1/2, a series from the late 80s and early to mid 90s, where transformation is pretty much the main plot hook. The secondary characters shift back and forth between various animal forms, while the main character Ranma, a teenage boy, periodically shifts into what society at large would describe as a female body. And for the record, that's an imperfect description for reasons I'll get into later. Similarly, in one of the earliest story arcs of Goonish Shive, the character Elliot gets hit with a transformation ray gun and turns into a female form named Ellen. Ellen eventually becomes her own unique character, existing concurrently to Elliot. So it's less of a Jekyll and Hyde thing and more of a Season 7 Stefan Urkel situation. A good portion of the comic, especially early on, does seem designed to indulge various transformation kinks and fetishes, gender-related or otherwise. Again, this is not that unusual as far as webcomics go, and there's really not anything wrong with it apart from being pretty blatant fan service. However, as the artwork gradually improves over the years, the writing also becomes a bit more emotionally mature, and the story manages to explore its transformation themes in a deeper, more complex way. This type of story convention is sometimes called gender swapping, but that's sometimes a bit of a misnomer, depending on whether or not the story makes a distinction between gender and sex. With some gender swapping stories, like Virtual Sexuality, which I reviewed a few years ago, there's an inherent essentialism between a character's body and gender identity. Their body is transformed, and either immediately or gradually over time, the character comes to think of themselves as truly being a different gender. And they may even experience a different form of sexual attraction, so the character technically remains heterosexual. In other stories, like Ranma 1/2, a character's body transforms, but they never truly think of themselves as belonging to a different gender. When Ranma is in his feminine form, he still thinks of himself as a boy, and his personality and romantic interests don't seem to change in any meaningful way. As critic Charlotte Finn puts it, Ranma isn't a boy who turns into a girl, he's a cisgender boy who turns into a transgender boy. And even that's probably not the most ideal terminology. A lot of the terms that we would normally use when talking about real-life trans people don't quite apply when talking about fictional, magical gender swapping. We can't really refer to gender-swapped Ranma as being assigned female at birth because he wasn't. Things are even more complicated in Goonish Shive, where it gets very loosey-goosey with the internal logic of gender swapping. Depending on the means through which a character transforms, they may or may not experience a new sexual orientation or a form of gender identification that aligns with their new form. Ellen, for instance, identifies as a bisexual homoromantic girl, even though Elliot is a straight boy. It gets very complex very quickly, but what I find unique about this particular story compared to other gender-swapping narratives is that the characters use transformation to explore their own personal gender and sexual identities. The character Ted, for instance, seems to have the most vested personal interest in transformations, often switching between male and female presenting bodies, and this eventually leads him to come out as gender fluid. This is somewhat reflective of the experience of Dan Shive himself, who has described his own gender identity as non-committal shrug. At one point, the characters have a gender-swapped themed birthday party, which, okay, just go with it. And the experience has a unique effect on Justin, a gay male character. Being in a feminine body, one that his friend Elliot finds physically attractive, forces Justin to confront his unrequited feelings for Elliot and his place in society as a gay person. It also leads him to experience something similar to gender dysphoria, which is something that very few gender-swapping stories include. This sort of thing is often handled clumsily, and I can't say that Goonish Shive always gets it right 100% of the time, but somehow I personally don't mind that too much. It's a story about teenagers, and when it gets messy or confusing or embarrassing, I think that's because being a teenager is messy and confusing and embarrassing, full of experimentation, questioning, figuring out who you are and your place in the world. That's something that all of us can relate to. Except for me, who has never made a mistake.